Hey everyone, and welcome to another Kanoa Reviews, where we review games both new and old on all platforms. If you like the content that I make, then please subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you never miss a review when it comes out. Today we talk about the game Warhammer 40K Gladius, a game that started out as a fairly small project by a tiny team, but by now has received many updates and DLCs, making it quite the grand game on a pretty epic scale. Basically, what it comes down to is that 40K Gladius is a civilization equivalent with the Warhammer 40K universe. This means it's a turn-based 4X game, where you explore, exploit, exterminate, and expand. 4X games like Civ or Gladius play on a grid-based map, with each grid indicating one movement for the unit. Each player or team takes turns and moves their units to explore the map and exploit its resources. They expand their own cities and settlements and eventually exterminate their enemies to claim victories. Now, in some more high-budget 4X games, you have a proper story-driven campaign accompanied with this, but in Gladius, that is not the case. The team that worked on this and the overall scale is simply too small. You just choose a new game and it drops you on a randomized map, and your goal is to win, plain and simple. There is a bit of background lore and story in the form of stills at the beginning, but it does not make the impression of a very slick or polished experience, and the rest of the story for each faction gets told through message pop-ups at the start and throughout the battle. Besides winning the game by defeating all the enemies, you can actually also win the game by completing a series of campaigns that the game throws at you. These campaigns and their objectives differ per faction that you play as, and the objectives can range from build a certain building or unit, to killing certain enemies, or collect certain items on the map, or collect and reunite certain units. Once some of these objectives are completed, you get rewards in the form of resources or units, and also a bit more backstory and lore, and sometimes you can also be invaded, or surprise attacked by enemy units triggered by the completion of the objective. These units can actually spawn pretty close to the base, and so you can actually get overwhelmed if you did not prepare and have defenses set up around the base. But probably most people will stick to trying to get a victory by eradicating all the enemy units on the map, since this is Warhammer 40K after all. It's also a stark contrast with something like Civ, where you don't have any diplomacy, since in this universe, there's only war. But it is a bit of a shame, since in previous games and stories, we have seen different species working together briefly to achieve a similar goal. Having diplomacy could add a bit more depth, but it's also not a huge loss since the rest of the game is so cool and works well. First, let's really quickly talk about the presentation of the game, before we dive a bit deeper into the gameplay and what I love so much about 40K Gladius. I will admit that the game is not really a looker. Unit models look okay-ish, but it's mostly their animations that are not so impressive, and the environments and overall presentation is not the best. You can see a clear contrast with something like Civ 6, where units are beautifully detailed and animated, even though that game is older. Many of the units in Gladius are a bit staticky, but they do serve their purpose, and it's still very cool to see some very iconic units enter the battlefields, like the Leman Russ tank or some of the hero characters. Sound-wise, it's also a bit lacking, and just overall, the visual and audio could hopefully one day use a tune-up. But I am happy to say that besides the presentation being a bit lackluster, the gameplay, depth, and variety you get is still very good and the real reason to play and experience this. Now, the original base game comes with 4 factions: the Imperial Guard, the Orcs, the Space Marines, and the Necrons. Each of these 4 factions plays really differently and have different perks and abilities that can drastically change your playstyle. For example, the Necrons are able to heal each turn, thereby making them quite easy as a starting faction, and also has you play a bit more reckless, since you can easily reconcile losses you take during a battle. Space Marines then can only have one main city per game, but they are able to deploy watchtowers over the battlefield, which will attack enemies as well, and placing these strategically can really give you a good edge in fighting enemies as they approach. The Imperial Guard then is really weak in the beginning, and will take massive losses with their infantry, pretty much how it should be according to the 40K lore. But if you stick it out and get your research up to the point where you can produce vehicles like the Leman Russ tank or, God forbid, the Baneblade, you are almost unstoppable. It's the complete opposite of the Necrons that have it so easy in the beginning, with their units being quite strong and able to heal. whereas the Imperial Guard infantry is so weak and fragile that they are a joke compared to some of the weakest units of other factions. I'm not kidding in that the weakest units of other factions like the Tyranids are 4 times stronger and more powerful than the Imperial Guard infantry. Whenever you defeat an enemy, your nearby units will gain experience and they can also level up to become stronger and get more health. A level 6 or 7 Space Marine squad is really menacing and incredibly powerful and threatening to anything it faces. But a level 5 or 6 Imperial Guard squadron can still be overpowered pretty easily by units that are weaker levels and is truly a waiting game for those powerful vehicles. Now, I do have to say that despite the Imperial Guard being so weak in the beginning, they are my absolute favorite faction, just because I love the Imperial Guard so much in general. The fact that it's regular humans taking on these larger-than-life beings and these literal gods amongst men is what I really love. In the lore, the Imperial Guard fights and dies by the millions each day, but they never give up and always continue to fight, if only because otherwise they will feel the end of the Commissar's Bolter. Now, it should also be mentioned that because of these differences with the factions, Gladius is not a well-balanced game, but in all honesty, I don't think many of us 40k fans want this. I think more people would be upset if the regular Imperial Guard would be able to go toe-to-toe with Space Marines or the Tau or Eldari. It's simply the case that some factions are stronger and more powerful and threatening than others, and I do think that 40k Gladius portrays this well in their units and playstyle that each brings. Since of course the Necrons are these machine zombie types, it makes sense to have the healing system be implemented with their faction since they rise up after being shot down in the lore. Now, as I said, the base game has 4 factions, but rarely have I seen a game where it has such wonderful DLC that you really want to get. Now, it also has some questionable DLC where it only adds 1 extra unit to the map and more of the like, but the 4 DLC packs you would really be interested in, and that I recommend, are the other 4 factions that you can get. There are the Chaos Space Marines, the Tyranids, the Tau, and the Eldari. I got all of them except the Chaos Space Marines, and it wasn't because I did not like the Chaos, but for the review I wanted to check the factions with entirely different looking units and tech. Each of these factions again play entirely different compared to the other ones, and it's so wonderful as it adds much needed variety and lengthens the game by a lot. The Tyranids, for example, utilize different resources than other factions and decompose everything they find into biomass. The Tyranids are of course all about pumping out units fast, and they are pretty powerful too, but they have this gimmick where they cannot head too far out in the open because they are controlled by the hive mind. You need to send in certain units amongst them to keep the lower ranks under your control. Otherwise, they will lose their self-control and start attacking both enemies, but also your own. It's a really cool and unique playstyle, and the same can also be said for the Eldari, for example. These units are able to move after an attack, making them very powerful and a legitimate threat, and making it different too how you approach battles, since you can take pop shots and then retreat, letting the enemy follow you for a potential ambush. They can also use gates you will find throughout the map to teleport, and this can be used strategically to reinforce allies or retreat to main cities to replenish units. No other factions can use these portals, and just every faction has something so unique and different about them that it's really cool to play as each and discover what new and unique ability you can do. It also is a great game for co-op with friends, and have each person be a different faction so that each will have a very different playstyle they need to cope with. Me and my friends Ryan and Greg had a wonderful time playing as different units and species, and just putting 3 enemy teams on the map as well and destroying them to claim victory. Like it's the norm with these 4X games, you can highly customize the game you're about to set up. You can have a lot of different factions partake in the battle. If you don't have much time, you can set up a quick match between 2 or maybe 3 different factions for a more brief and fast experience that will only take a handful of turns. Or if you have a bit more time, you can set up a game between 5 or 6 different factions and maybe split some of them up into teams and have them work together to conquer the map, which will then significantly take longer. Then if you want a battle or game of epic proportions, you would just throw up a map full of different factions, maybe 9 or more, and have each faction be a different species and dividing them into teams or having them all be separate for an epic free-for-all, and have a match that will last more than 200 turns, which will take hours and hours. I do love these really epic scaled battles with at least 8 factions, and how I often play it when I'm playing by myself is letting me be the Imperial Guard and then having me team up with the Space Marines controlled by an AI and then together battle it out against all the other enemies, which each is a different faction. It's still really entertaining and fun when playing on your own, though since it's a bit more passive than your average strategy game, it is a game where I like to listen to a podcast or show while playing it. Despite you waging war on an epic scale, there's something very tranquil and relaxing about the Gladius experience. You just click a bit here, send some units over there, and that's that for each turn. It's really chill and a great game to play during the evening when winding down. Besides how many factions are fighting on the map, you also can customize other parameters, like how much landmass there is, the size of the map itself, etc. You can also customize how many critters there are on the map, and these critters are an important gameplay aspect as well. See, when you play the game, you will often come across enemies that are neutral, often fauna like indigenous species or creatures, but also deserters of certain factions or even giant robots or monsters. Killing these will earn you experience to level up your units, and they are often easier than the infantry of the other AI-controlled factions, and so you would do well to go and hunt these critters to gain experience and level up your units. Since units near the kills will all get experience, it's often encouraged to keep your units close together instead of splitting them up. Especially if you play as the weak Imperial Guard, you will often need at least 3 different squads to bring down one enemy. Some of these critters are also really terrifying and powerful, like the big robots or the units that will enslave your own men, which will then turn on you until you destroy the enemy that turned them. The AI in general also does a pretty good job of attacking, but mostly retreating whenever it is necessary. If you manage to get an enemy's HP down to but a sliver, you could very well wave goodbye to that unit, since it will surely run to go and heal elsewhere in their turn. With the fog of war, it's very easy to lose the enemy from your sight, and thus it becomes pretty challenging. Especially Necron AI can be a big problem, since they will retreat and heal each time and charge you down with all their remaining units. Besides just fighting, you are also constantly starting new research, and this is basically the tech tree that comes with each faction. These tech trees are also pretty impressive with how large and expansive they are, and they can give great boosts like more armor or damage for your units, unlocking certain hero characters, or buildings that give additional resources or add new vehicles or abilities that will be useful in future clashes. It will often take a lot of turns before these researches are done, but you can also build certain buildings to speed up this process. There's a good amount to build and micromanage in your city too, with many different buildings giving additional resources, and having multiple buildings that provide, for example, units will speed up that process as well. There's enough to do in this game, and in all honesty, it has something for everyone, as long as you are a 40K fan. And that's kind of my only thing with the game. If you are not a 40K fan, it might not have as much as you want compared to other 4X games out there. But if you are a Warhammer 40K fan, this game is certainly a game that should not be missed. It might have been lacking a bit when it originally came out with only 4 factions, but now with 8 in total, and maybe more coming in the future, it's something that not a lot of other 40K games can offer. It truly comes very close to that board game or tabletop experience, and despite the small scale of the squadrons, you do feel like you are battling war on a very epic scale, especially in the later rounds towards the end when you are moving dozens of units over the map. I will say that a game like Dawn of War is probably still the better game of the two. Dawn of War has a polished, well-produced campaign, lots of units to play as with great animations, different maps and content that will keep you entertained for months. But there's just something about Gladius that makes me tick, to where I love sitting back a whole evening and battle it out with friends, or against or with the AI, and have a really great time. In a way, it feels more epic sometimes than Dawn of War, despite everything visually being less impressive. But it's rare to find other 40K games out there that have so many units of so many different factions and species within the same game. Despite there not being a campaign and only one game mode, the variety with the different factions you can play as is enough to make it entertaining for hours and hours on end, and it's well worth your money and time in my opinion. Often Warhammer 40K games are pretty mediocre or don't come close in what they want to achieve. But I'm happy to say that Warhammer 40K Gladius is definitely a game catering to the 40K fan and something that should not be missed. In the end, Warhammer 40K Gladius gets an 8.4. Just writing this review has me hyped up and wanting to play the game again. There are still so many ways to play and win that I haven't tried yet, like certain objective campaigns for various factions and species. I'm also always hyped to play this with friends, and I hope that this review will at least convince some of you fans out there to go and get this game and have a great and epic time with it. See you all on the battlefield, comrades, for the Emperor.